The Afterdeath Journal of an American Philosopher, The World View of William James, by Jane Roberts, and this is Chapter 3, How This Book Happened and the Webs of Consciousness. Seth's session on James and consciousness was held in May 1976. Rob filed it along with other miscellaneous sessions that weren't part of the Seth books, and nearly forgot it. For one thing, I had no intention of trying to tune into James's worldview, and besides, the whole affair went into the psychological background as I worked on other manuscripts. I took time out to help Rob prepare Volume 1 of Seth's The Unknown Reality for publication. I was typing the completed Cezanne book, and Seth had begun dictating the next, The Nature of the Psyche, Its Human Expression. Yet Seth must have known what was going to happen, in some fashion or other, because over 6 months later, in January 1977, I awakened one morning with the title of this present book in mind. Just the title, nothing else. I didn't think too much about this. I've had titles and sometimes whole outlines of books suddenly come to me before. Sometimes they take in quotes, and sometimes they just end up as footnotes in other books. After breakfast, though, I felt restless, and instead of working down at the big table in the living room, where I'd done my writing for months, I went out to the small studio off the kitchen. This was the same room, I remembered later, in which I had begun the Cezanne manuscript. At the time, I didn't make the connection. Rob and I always read during meals. I was thinking vaguely of an article I'd read at breakfast and sipping coffee when the next moment the entire first paragraph of the Afterdeath Journal of an American Philosopher suddenly filled my mind. I think I muttered something like, "Hey, what about that?" and started taking the words down as fast as I could on my typewriter. Although I knew instantly that the American Philosopher was the title was William James, I hedged a little bit on this in the beginning. After all, I thought James's name wasn't mentioned in the title, and it didn't appear in the rest of the material that came as quickly as I could type for the rest of the morning. And as I wrote, the usual questions annoyed me like a swarm of buzzing bees. Was this manuscript supposed to originate with the historic William James? Was the material my creative version of the man instead? Or something else happening, some commingling of consciousness in which valid knowledge from unofficial levels of reality expressed itself in a form that I could understand? Though these questions went through one part of my mind, they in no way disturbed the flow of the words that came in rapidly and smoothly. You can question what's happening on a TV while you watch it, and in the same way, I could wonder about the events that were occurring on this other unofficial screen of my mind. In fact, I almost always do. And I kept thinking, strange. Nothing in our immediate lives had triggered this sudden new manuscript. And by the fact that the title had been given, and by the feel of the words, I could tell that somebody, James, was definitely beginning something he meant to finish. I thought of the few pages of James's Varieties of Religious States that I'd seen in my mind a year and a half before, and I felt some bewilderment. This wasn't that book, and rather quarrelsomely I thought that psychics were always getting James. The last thought was the one that bothered me the most, and had, since I first saw James's small paperback, in my mental vision. I nearly forgot Seth's statements about James. If I'd remembered them, I would have felt better. From his first words of this present manuscript, though something else bothered me. From the first words of this present manuscript, though, something else bothered me. James obviously was commenting on our world in a way that Cezanne didn't, or hadn't, rather. This implied a response of James continuing his interest in our reality. And again, if I'd remembered that 775th session of last May, I would have been better prepared for James's liveliness in this respect, for the numerous interactions between us that happened as the manuscript continued. The delivery of the manuscript developed its own set of conventions along the way. Most of it was written automatically. First and final draft directly on the typewriter, except, of course, for the publisher's copy, which had to be neater. Much of it came in a surprising way, though. When I was sketching, and I thought I was finished with a day's writing, as a result, my small sketch pads were filled with page upon page of scribbled James's material that I took down with whatever colored pen I happened to be using at the moment for my ink sketches. Then I'd have to type up that material the following day. And often while doing that, James would begin again with new material. Finally, as spring approached and I went out on the front porch to sketch, I'd prepared 2 sketchbooks, one for James and one for me. But there was something quite pleasant, intimate, and almost cozy about getting James in longhand. And I think, at least, that he liked this procedure the best. On too many occasions to remember, dictation would suddenly begin while I was doing the dishes or other house chores, and several times during lunch. I'd added a few notes of my own through James's manuscript to show when I sensed any emotional interaction between James and myself, because that always surprised me. With Cezanne, I felt rather like a secretary, while James and I had a more personal working relationship. James, oddly enough, seemed aware of my sketching, and as you'll see, he commented at times. Cezanne, however, either couldn't have cared less about my amateur attempts or just considered them beneath his notice. I suspect that Cezanne wasn't aware of my reality to any strong degree, only of his own. James also entered into my dreams several times, and I experienced 2 clear visions that explained certain portions of his text. These are also described in my notes, along with the date and the time of each entry. The manuscript came definitely as a book, with its own title and structure. All I did was add chapter headings. James begins by discussing parapsychology, evolution, and religion in his time and ours, stressing areas in which he feels his vision was not daring enough. He traces the development of such ideas as they relate to democracy and to the growth of the United States, and stresses the connections between man's image of himself, God, and governments. Then begins a fascinating discussion of his own experiences of life after death. Some passages in particular are full of humor and brilliance, as James, the psychologist and philosopher, finds himself in a school for philosophers, and where he is definitely a junior member. In any case, here we see a definite personality and his own interests and characteristics moving from one level of reality to another, as someday all of us will. I felt for James and for myself as I took down his description of the doubts, hopes, and bouts of melancholy that had characterized his life. It was impossible not to think of all such people caught between faith and doubt, inner and outer experience. Impossible not to identify with James's own strongly conflicting ideas about humanity. Yet it was James's knowing the light and atmospheric presence encountered after death that most captivated and comforted me. His divine psychology and his intent to share his new knowledge, to teach as he learns. As he learns, did I suppose that a William James, a discarnate person, was sitting at a celestial desk somewhere dictating through mentally sophisticated dictaphone equipment, namely me? No. There are places in the manuscript where James describes his part in our rather bizarre arrangement, and there were several instances where I was so caught up in his emotions that for a moment his purposes merged with mine, or mine with his, so that the two of us spoke at once, synchronized, united, each from his own positions in time and space. This book doesn't involve any literary stance, but a stance taken by consciousness itself. It's not a communication from William James in the conventionally understood manner of mediums and spirits, but a situation in which one consciousness takes the stance of another and views reality from that standpoint. There are definite differences in my experiences with worldviews so far. When I'm inspired myself, emotional excitement seizes me according to the impact of the ideas and feelings I'm presented with. Except for the instances of emotional involvement with James just mentioned, however, with worldviews, I'm not caught up in the writing myself. It just comes. I respond to it, but it isn't mine. I realize that on other levels, I must be translating the other consciousness perception into my own vocabulary to a certain extent, and that the material must be mixing with the content of my own mind. But I'm not aware of any of that. I'm not in a trance, as the word is currently understood, either. In a way, it was like having two mental or psychological focuses instead of one. I can be doing chores, quite busy with my own thoughts, for example, when new lines come to me from other sources. They are intrusive in that I recognize them as not mine. On the other hand, I can close them out at will if I want to, so there is never any compulsion involved. And if the thoughts in this manuscript were mine, then why cast them in James's guise? Not for financial reasons, certainly. The mass market would prefer a good disaster novel, and not for creative reasons. I can write my own books in that regard. I could have written James's thoughts as my own. Yet, while I share most of his opinions and agree heartily with his opinions on Freudianism and Darwinism, some of his opinions on age, for example, aren't mine at all. More than this, the manuscript reflects the ideas of a man, one perhaps too autocratic for all his declarations of man's equality, perhaps elegant for the democratic comradeship he espoused. Both the World View of Paul Cezanne and the Afterdeath Journal of an American Philosopher were written while Seth was delivering his own book, The Nature of the Psyche, its human expression. And I don't believe any coincidence is involved. Instead, both worldview manuscripts illuminate the ways in which the individual psyche can reach beyond itself into the psychic and psychological realities. Into other psychic and psychological realities. Both manuscripts illustrate Seth's contention that our consciousness, while individual, can make many kinds of alliances, and its knowledge is not limited to physical information alone, and that its mobility and gifts far surpass our current psychologies. I explain the entire affair to myself as follows. The James reality still exists. It can be tuned into, because we're the kind of creatures that we are. When this happens, the information comes alive through us, mixes with the contents of our minds, and interacts with them, so that a new reality is formed, a new creative synthesis. In other words, when our kind of consciousness tunes in to the still present consciousness of someone like James, who is dead in our terms, the combination automatically clicks together, forming a real personality, combining the separate sets of traits. A viable transpersonality that stands for what we are and what the other reality is. The personality I sense as James is a construct, I believe unconsciously formed as an automatic process when my consciousness tunes into his reality, and it stands for or represents whatever James' reality really is now. The difference is important, for several times I sensed a figure I thought was James walking up and down the living room floor, arms folded, deep in thought, and aware of me. I found it difficult to believe that a spiritualized James existed in that particular fashion, even though I did believe that James still existed. A moot point, perhaps, but I still think that when we make such assumptions, when we only project... let me start that sentence over again. But I still think that when we make such assumptions, often we only project our own limited ideas about personality into an afterlife. At times, for example, I mentally heard James commenting on my sketches, and I think that in such situations we end up with the creation of a quite real personality capable of originating action, responsive, in this case, the psychic offspring of Jane / James, able to operate between his world and ours. My own experience shows me that the boundaries of the self are of a stranger nature than supposed. They shift, opening up other areas of subjective thought and fancy, as if any one personality, following a journey through his own reality, would encounter other quite as valid selves, each with its own existence, and ultimately find within that vast psychological structure the reflection, at least, of each other person alive on the planet in this or any other time. I believe that each person's private reality, fully explored, would eventually bring him into contact with every other individual on a subjective level, that each person is reflected in every other, and that through the creative processes we can and often do open up doors leading to experiences that are not our own. Writing from a viewpoint that is someone else's, living or dead, and viewing reality from a completely different standpoint. Because of my own experiences, I wonder how many writers have doctored their material, rewritten it from their own focus, changed names and references in order to fit their work into the cultural, scientific, or religious context of their times. That kind of pretense is against my nature, but it has its advantages, and I was tempted at least to present everything from the Seth material on in such a manner. Such a disguised version would be accepted on its own, with no necessity for me to explain the status of the author, or more difficult to explain that the author was a composite of my own consciousness and a consciousness of another level, at another level, or of my consciousness and the consciousness of someone else at another level. The trouble is that our psychological theories are too small to contain our reality. They certainly don't explain the nature of our reality. No, they certainly don't explain the nature of our creativity or arts. So the Afterdeath Journal of an American Philosopher presented me with considerable questions and philosophical dilemmas. Again, I'd been suspicious of manuscripts supposed to originate with the well-known dead, and now I had two of them. I could view Seth as a sort of super Psyche, since he seemed to be tied to no one historical period. Cezanne, however, was a famous artist. I think that it was my desire to please Rob that let the manuscript come through, at least in large part. That and my own curiosity, which is seemingly endless and more exuberant than my attempts to explain what it uncovers. And through the years, Rob has mentioned William James. Though he's only read one of his books, there are many other authors, both living and dead, that he speaks of far more often. So why James? I really didn't want James to come from one standpoint anyway, because other automatic scripts are supposed to originate with his authorship. Yet, for all my qualms, from the first moment I saw that small book in my mental eyes, I was taken with James on a personal level, with his rather old-fashioned manner of thought and expression, and the tension he suffered between his emotional and intellectual beliefs during his lifetime. I think that I identified with that tension, for like James, I am continually aware of the different conclusions often drawn by emotions and intellect, and most likely, as Seth states, that identification was the key. I recognized that James' feelings reflected mine in certain areas, at least, and that this coincidence opened up the mental and psychological connections necessary between us. I, too, was distressed at the gaudy trappings of the psychic field, the uneasy mixture of pseudoscience and pseudo-spirituality. I, too, was scandalized by some muddy thinking scientists with psychic bents, by psychics who cast their spooky predictions in scientific garb, and by the generally poor quality of periodicals and journals dealing with psychic phenomena. In short, like James, I often disapproved. Yet again, like James, I hoped and continue to hope. Like James and many other of my readers, I'm caught between the idealistic picture of mankind and man's practical performance. But James has a different viewpoint from mine or yours. James can look back and put himself in our position, and then from his new reality point out directions that each of us can follow to our advantage. His material on biological faith particularly intrigues and comforts me, and as he moves his discussion from his experiences in his life to those afterward, he shares profound insights that offer an end to melancholy for those so inclined, and a philosophy that allows us to see the best in man while avoiding Pollyanna attitudes towards his sometimes reprehensible behavior. More often, James offers faith to those who feel they must enjoy a certain independence from any specific religious beliefs, and he describes a divine psychology in a way that inspires the emotions and the intellect alike. Botanists collect exotic species of plants and flowers. Other people collect rocks. Scientists observe the strange properties of physical matters. I collect my own unusual subjective experiences, observe the classic meeting of the psyche with knowledge and data not its own, the opening of the psyche so seemingly alien, subjective environments. No, let me read that sentence again. I think I scrambled it. I collect my own unusual subjective experiences, observe the classic meeting of the psyche with knowledge and data not its own, the opening of the psyche to seemingly alien subjective environments. Then I try to examine what I found and place it in a context of creativity larger than the pat categories already prepared by our society, religions, or psychologies. So I guess I go on subjective field trips through the psyche and then bring back what I can to the laboratory of my own mind, asking, what have we here? And trying to discover how the seemingly exotic species of psychic events fits into the entire picture of reality. Seth's conception of consciousness certainly corroborates my own experience, and I think that sometime or other, each of us finds bits and pieces of other consciousness in our minds lying there like odd, shiny pebbles on the shores of our awareness. As children, we may have reacted with delight and astonishment, turning such thoughts over and over in our mental hands, playing with them like toy balls that bounced against our own imaginings. But as adults, we're so worried about defending our own identities, so jealous for their boundaries, that we run away at the first glimpse of a feeling or a thought that we can't categorize. Any idea we consider uncharacteristic, any stray hope that may eventually let us down. So we cut our psychological reality down to size, allowing foreign films to be played on the screens of our minds only in dreams, where we don't have to acknowledge them or account for them. We ignore our fantasies, desperately worried about testing them against reality, because our definitions of reality might then have to change. We might discover that the fantasies provide a rich dimension to life that had been lacking, fenced out by proven truth. We may discover that dreams are more practical than facts in the long run, and what an awful surprise, AWE, and what an awful surprise that will be. We may discover that only the imagination can glimpse those greater dimensions of our being in which our lives are couched. We may die of boredom, though our bellies are full of wholesome bread, and find that nutrition is indeed more than we can eat. We may find that fiction can be closer to truth than facts are, and that proven facts are merely the fictions we've authenticated, our official fiction, as it were. Perhaps by demanding predictable experiments that always produce the same results, science short-circuits itself and us, because we are not predictable, and no two of us are really alike. So, though my times and James' times are decades apart, and in our terms, I am alive and he is dead, to some extent the two of us speak with one voice. For he had high hopes, James, for psychology and the sciences, and since his time, we've fallen far short of their promises. So if James could speak with his own voice, this is what he would say. And the next chapter is, we're done with the introduction now, I should say, and the next chapter is entitled A General Introduction to My Interest and Times. Wow, I can hardly wait. I hope you're enjoying this, and if you are, click subscribe, then you'll get more of these, and click like to help me out, because I'm trying to create a small spiritual channel here. Thanks so much for listening. Bye for now.